Hello there. I'm here for one of my stories. This is Lindsay Dunn interviewing Lotfy Nathan, the director and writer of The Carpenter's Son, coming out in theaters on November 14th. Lotfy, welcome to one of my stories. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Just to tell you a little bit about me, I write for my own website, One of My Stories, and I also work with a group called Arts and Faith, which is a group who care deeply about the intersection of faith and film. So I was very interested to check out your film, of course.
hmm
In looking at your filmography so far, you started out as a documentary director, and I understand you also have a background in painting, and that your background as a painter informs your filmmaking. So tell me more about that. How does your painting and your art inform your work as a filmmaker?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm just a more of a concern with the image, very visually driven. I try to imagine a lot of the shots and the scenes that way. I think
Mhm.
probably the writing, which I have done with my project so far, is maybe a little less natural, but you start to learn how to kind of do it from a visual standpoint. But yeah, I think that's basically just my appreciation for movies largely is with the visual experience. At least initially, I think I ended up realizing how much strength there is in the human story and in the characters and relationships that you can get out of films as well. But that was I would say that was my entry point with art.
So, your newest film, The Carpenter's Son, is making waves before people have even seen it. And people are on edge whenever someone makes an on screen story about Jesus. Yet you were brave enough to do so anyway. So, what did you personally find compelling about this story that made it something you wanted to put on film?
Yeah, well, that's a good point you make. I think that there has been backlash, but it's not with everyone because I think most people, even within the faith audience, aren't averse to depicting the Christian story. I think that that's actually a long-standing tradition in Christianity. That's one point. But sorry, your question was how I got into it.
Just to say a little more,
Yeah.
it feels like a lot of times people are ready to be offended. Like you said, it's not everybody, but I am a Christian and I don't like when I see fellow Christians bashing a movie they haven't even seen just
Mm,
because they're worried it's going to be offensive towards Jesus. But what I'm doing here is trying to give you an opportunity to explain
yeah.
why you wanted to tell the story. I don't know what your background is, but
hmm
if you're not a Christian, then you're not necessarily looking to tell a story that's meant to be a worshipful portrait, but you're still trying to convey something that's important to you. Otherwise, you wouldn't make this movie.
Of course, of course. Sorry, now I get it. Well, I was raised Coptic Orthodox Christian. So as a child, I was raised by family who were extremely devout, also aware as a child of all of the stories, and fascinated by the stories of the New Testament, and had a lot of questions as many kids do, in Sunday school. There were images also, my interest in art that stuck with me in the imagery around in the church that I'd see. But I haven't been very religious in my adult life, and I am a filmmaker, so I'm always looking out for ideas. My father, who is very interested in religious history and old religious texts, introduced me to the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is the apocryphal gospel, non-canonical texts, which I had no idea about. And up until then had no ambition to make any film about religion, let alone something directly on the Holy Family or telling this polarizing story of this missing timeline in the New Testament, which is extremely subjective and unknown. But I was just so interested in that opportunity to make a film, which I had never really seen done in the way that I would like to see it.
Hmm.
A film about that missing piece of the timeline. I just thought, the novelty of that to me is extremely interesting. And it's something that is little known, and that kind of thing for me as a storyteller, so sort of begs to be explored. So that was really my initial entry point. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, to me, if I was to do a one-to-one adaptation of that, I think it would be pretty salacious, because in reading that text, it's brutal. So I can understand why there's a reservation wariness when you hear that it's an adaptation of that. Really, for me, that was just an entry point in saying, okay, I'd like to try to tell a story about the part of Jesus' life that's not accounted for in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Right. I haven't read the book. Maybe I will someday.
It's a quick read. It's a fast read.
No,
I think it'll take you 20 minutes.
it didn't seem to be exactly, the film isn't exactly like you said, a faithful interpretation of that
No,
even.
no.
It's a starting point, like you mentioned. I like that framing.
Yeah, and then outside of that, the movies today, you've got all of these superhero flicks, all of these origin stories, and just the idea that that could lend itself to Jesus's story, to me, was just incredibly interesting. It was never from a antagonistic place of wanting to skewer religion by any means, but it's, it is touching on something that isn't part of the canon and isn't necessarily accepted. That's the tricky dance.
Mm-hmm. So let's move over to cast for just a minute.
Yeah.
So I come to this film, I'm a huge Nicolas Cage fan. I'm a huge Noah Jupe fan.
Hmm.
I'm a huge FKA Twigs fan. I fell in love with those two when they did Honey Boy together.
Hmm.
So Noah is an extraordinary talent, as is Isla Johnston. And how did you pick them, or what was the process for picking them as the everlasting pair of Jesus and Satan?
Hmm. Well, Noah, I was connected with through my manager, had brought up Noah, and it was just a great idea. I was always such a fan of his work. And we met after he read the script. He tells me he didn't really even know that it was about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
When he read the script, he read it pretty blind. And in my screenplay, I didn't mention the people by name. So it was the boy, the mother,
Mm-hmm.
the carpenter, the stranger was Satan. And he really gravitated towards it. And we met and had just a great discussion about it. And Noah, besides his great body of work, and what he's already done, just seems so sensible about where he wants to be going and the way he wants to treat stories and the films that he decides to do. And just at his young age, his confidence in dealing with such a challenging role and keeping it grounded. I think that was the most important thing. So that was how Noah came to play. Isla, we had been casting for ages for that character. And initially, I was going to have a boy. That was the plan. But we had over 20,000 casting submissions for that. She was just incredible. Not at all what I would have expected. She looked kind of sweet. And I always pictured this more threatening or upsetting thing, but she just had this really hypnotic gaze. And it just is amazing dance between vulnerability and, danger,
Mm-hmm.
which was
Yes.
just amazing. I mean, I think she's just an incredibly compelling actress, and so that's how they came to be. I just was hooked once I saw her tape.
You talked about framing and creating of shots and how you think about that as with your background of painting.
Hmm.
The word that came to me looking at the shots, which I thought were great, was claustrophobic and uncomfortable. But it worked really well for this film where we see all these portrayals of suffering. Often, when people are trying to make a beautiful film, they create these perfectly crafted shots that are aesthetically pleasing with wide open spaces.
Hmm.
And in this film, it's the opposite. There are a few shots where there's wide open. Joseph, the carpenter, he sees the light. But instead, most of the time, there's this suffocating feel of things being imperfect. A perfect example is when Satan or the stranger, is hanging from the tree and there's these just trees going in every which direction. How did
Yeah.
you create that throughout the film? Because it's pretty consistent. Tell me about creating your framing there.
Yeah, it was a decision with this to try to find a more narrowed, confining scope, in the image. So we did this 35 millimeter and 2 perf, which is a more narrower frame, and we were doing a good deal of close-ups. I think to me, partly it was just to try to undercut the idea of this being sort of a grand biblical epic kind of stories, is more about a
Mm-hmm.
narrow scope, a narrow time in the life of Jesus and the Holy Family. That's given in the title as well, the idea of carpenter's son, when he was just the carpenter's son. So that was part of the idea there. I will be honest and say that we also at times were limited with our sets and our
Mm.
what we could cover, so we weren't able to get these great big wide shots a lot of the time. But I think it did end up helping with this feeling of, like you said, of claustrophobia and subjectivity. It's kind of like tight proximity with the characters.
So there's also on that same kind of thing of subjectivity. I was thinking of the word perception. There's
Hmm.
this interesting moment in the film when Jesus goes to the marketplace and there are these background noises amplified. Like he takes the rope and you can hear the rope really loud, and there's the hammer hitting the anvil. And it dawned on me that this was, in a way, putting us into Jesus's perception, that his
Hmm.
perception is different than other people. So, what was the purpose behind that sound design choice? Because it never really came back again, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, I think it was just introduced this idea. I would almost call it like a super empathy, like this sense of awareness of surroundings that might be more heightened.
Hmm.
When I just thought that it was a great opportunity to do that with the sound design. It's not throughout the whole film, but I think it's just to try to give a bit of a sense of understanding of environment being more detailed and nuanced maybe than in a normal person.
Right. So, another really compelling scene was when Satan takes Jesus to see the prisoners accused of sorcery, and the air is filled with suffering. Suffering is a big part of this film, but in that scene in particular, I felt like Satan hopes perhaps to scare Jesus a little bit with this demonstration, but it backfires on them big time. So, what research, if any, did you do to prepare how you're going to set up that scene? I'm also assuming it might have been one of the more complicated parts of the film to stage out.
Yeah, so I wanted it to feel like the stranger, Isla's character, was taking Jesus to a piece of theater, like to kind of witness this circus act, sneaking him into a show. That
Hmm.
would be the perspective of the devil, to go and see this as a way that fetishizes these sort of things. But for Jesus, it's disturbing. So that had to do with the space that we'd be looking at,
Hmm.
and that's kind of what I conveyed to Jean-Vincent Puzeau, our production designer, and he ended up creating this space that you could witness from one angle against a cliffside that was really barbaric, and there were all these sort of like savage torture stations. And we just tried to create some story behind each of those shots. But what was really important to that scene was balancing it with the discussion that's happening between Jesus and the devil there.
Hmm.
Which, like you said, and I'm really glad that you picked up on that. It's really about her in that moment trying to overwhelm him, or to
Hmm.
frighten him. No, but I think it's what I wanted to get across is that it actually appeals, it triggers some kind of heartfelt, empathetic response for him, rather
Right.
than defaulting to fear.
Okay, one more final question. Joseph, the family dynamics are intriguing in that Mary has this greater share of faith and seems to sense more that everything's okay. Joseph's more hard on Jesus and he feels doubt.
Hmm.
And the way he sort of enacts that is he's obsessed with cleanliness and this harsh image echoed in the rabbi Jesus learns from of what worshiping God should be like.
Hmm.
And in a way that feels similar to how in the canonical Gospels the Pharisees operated, and that made Jesus so angry when he saw how they were so obsessed with those ritual cleanliness and
Mm.
kind of imposing that. So was this in your mind at all? Was
Yeah, yeah,
Joseph
yeah. And
and
his rebellion against that dogma, the dogmatic,
right, the Jesus we see later in
regimented.
the
Yeah,
scriptures is like wants to free people from that.
right.
That was intriguing to me that it felt sort of like this is Jesus before, and maybe now we see why he acted that way after.
Yeah, yeah. Although I did try to imply that there were some things that he takes after from Joseph. Even, the story and what Jesus is later, than the whole idea that Joseph was a carpenter in this story, and even the washing of the feet, something that he maybe would have witnessed Joseph doing. I tried to have it that
Mhm.
he was learning from him, but yeah, I think that there's an attitude towards the dogmatic, regimented, practicing your faith through rigor and
Mhm.
rules, right? And it was a way that I ended up portraying Joseph as all too human, was how I wanted to
Right.
put him in my mind. But I thought that he would maybe not have had the same innate assurance of what was going on as, say, Mary, who
Mhm.
had this in her body, this understanding, whereas he is a human who was given these signals, these messages, right?
Right.
And that's what he had to work with besides his faith. So I imagine Joseph would be a zealot. He would be incredibly devout, and was looking at uh, the rules of Jewish antiquity at the time, and giving that to him as a sort of fixation. And then
Mhm.
plus Jesus as a coming of age, and someone who is in a state of rebellion in this story, and also is defining his own understanding of what this is, this power,
Mhm.
which is independent of the dogma and the rules. So I hope that answers it a little bit,
No, yeah, it does.
because coming he's from a more elemental place than, say, Joseph, which is, it's a cerebral faith and worship.
Mhm. Yeah, don't worry everybody, it's not totally negative towards Joseph. He has some wisdom to share throughout the movie.
Yeah, no, 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 exactly. No, no, I don't mean that at all. I speak about that weakness, but I think that also what this endeavors to show is the great sacrifice that Joseph would have made in being the guardian of Jesus.
Mhm. Yeah. So, where would you recommend people follow updates about the film? Where would be the best place for them to do that? Is there a website or an Instagram account you would point people towards?
Yeah, there's mine, which is Lotfy underscore. That's my Instagram, or the Magnolia Pictures Instagram account.
Okay.
There's also a website for the film. I think it's just the Carpenter's Son movie or something like that.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Lotfi, so much for your time today, and it was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody.